Hi, you're listening to the Buryan podcast, and this is the third part of our Crimean Tatar series. My name is Yevgeny, and I am a Ukrainian-born decolonial media activist and a coordinator of this podcast. Today I want to share with you some fragments of the conversation between Elnara Nuriieva-Letova, who is a Crimean Tatar cross-media activist, author, publicist, and a project manager of Crimea Public Media Jemaat, and Alexandr Murtazayev, an independent Crimean Tatar history researcher and author who frequently collaborates with the International Memorial Society and independent media projects centered around indigenous resistance. In their conversation, Alex and Elnara touch upon such topics as methods of Soviet and Russian oppression of indigenous peoples and the ways of the Crimean Tatar resistance. They share their family stories and talk about some of the most prominent figures of the movement. But most importantly, they speak of solidarity, both within the Crimean Tatar national movement and beyond it. This conversation, despite dealing with such painful topics as political repressions and ethnic cleansing, was full of hope and admiration for the activists, their courage and determination. So, let's get started.
One can hear quite often that Crimean Tatars are all born as activists. As a Crimean Tatar myself, I can only confirm this. I believe that it's centuries of colonial policy of Russia. That's what made us this way. So now I'd like to discuss the mechanisms of repression against Crimean Tatars. I believe you'd be the best person to summarize all that.
You made a really good point, because that's what I read in Yuri Osmanov's book. He's a Crimean Tatar historian and activist, and he says exactly that being a Crimean Tatar is basically a political experience from birth, and it doesn't even end after death either.
Very much so.
Right? So the mechanisms employed by the state, we can see a lot of those same mechanisms in settler colonial states, because they just inspire each other. They just borrow mechanisms from each other, like fueling the animosity and anxiety of settlers, for example, or trying their best to make the people assimilate so they don't cause any more trouble. Even the very deportation, which I'm listing as the mechanism number one, the physical resettlement, the physical destruction of people and their property. Lots of experts say that the main reason for that, it's just not profitable and just doesn't work long term when you have an indigenous population of a place in that place. Because, of course, the population is super connected to that place. They will do their utmost to keep it free, to keep it at least self-governing. So what you need to do if you want to get to Crimea, and Crimea is it's a good spot geopolitically. It's right in the middle of everywhere. You got like connections to Turkey. You can get to the sea. If you want that, first you have to get rid of the people who live there. So deportation is number one. The second mechanism, I'd say, is what we call an ethnocide. So the destruction of culture and memory, the destruction of cultural and historical landmarks in Crimea, mosques, books, cemeteries. All of that was just leveled down. The renaming of Crimean Tatar toponyms, a hotly discussed topic right now. So every single Crimean Tatar sounding location was renamed after the deportation to Russian sounding names, to
Soviet sounding.
Yeah, Soviet sounding. Yeah.
Red something.
Yeah, red something, October something,
Exactly.
February something. Yeah. And as I said, the very ethnonym Crimean Tatar was replaced by Tatar. And you can see a lot of cases, for example, transcriptions from trials where a Crimean Tatar would say, I am a Crimean Tatar and I was born in the Crimean ASSR. And the judges would get so mad. Like, you can't be that because there is no Crimean Tatar as a nation and there's no Crimean
They
USSR.
were never there.
Yeah,
They never
yeah,
existed.
yeah.
They just came from Uzbekistan.
Yeah,
This is
Mongols, something.
such a stupid
Yeah,
narrative. Like,
yeah.
we are called Crimean Tatars for a reason.
Yeah.
And I had these fights, even at the university, because some of my group mates, they really believed that Crimean Tatars escaped war or something, and that's why they came to Crimea. I was like, are you kidding me? No, we returned to our homeland.
So yeah, the Crimean Tatar people as a people were removed from the register of peoples of the USSR. The language was removed from the register of languages. There were lots of attempts to just forcibly assimilate them into Uzbekistan. Another one, I'd say, is just the total physical control during the years of special settlements and how special settlements were. Basically, during the deportation, families were broken. Entire communities were broken. So people from the same family would end up on the different ends of Uzbekistan. And they would not be able to contact each other or go see each other because the special settlements regime itself, like you couldn't move, you couldn't leave the territory without making it known to like the controlling officer. Like, for example, like your mom died, you have to go to the funeral, but you're not allowed to go to the funeral. So you either do this and you get years of labor camps for breaking the special settlements regime, or you didn't, and then what breaks is the familial connection. So they very purposefully broke those connections, broke those social bonds that Crimean Tatar society survived through, so that, exactly what they've been fearing, the preservation of cultural memory, of identity, just people helping each other out, they made sure that this would be as difficult as possible. And still we can see the results of this politics, actually, because the three different dialects of Crimean Tatar, which were very distinct before the deportation, mixed up during the settlement regime. So yeah, there's the physical control. You can't do anything you want. You can't do anything.
Can I chime in with another example? My granny, she was a choreographer. She was a dancer, and she was a part of whatever Philharmony in Mariel. And she was the only one of the artists who was guarded by a guy with a gun.
Yeah, basically guys with guns.
And she had to dance on the stage, and there was a guy who was sitting in the first row watching what she was doing. And then when the whole group was leaving, she was leaving with the guard, with armed person. It's not guard. Wow. It's like soldier. It's military person. So this is for a dancer.
This actually reminds me a lot of cases of prisoners of labor camps. Sometimes those who also had artistic talents, they were pressured, allowed to, don't know the exact term, to perform in theaters that were constructed for the people who ran the camp. And all while they were performing, their guards would be in the audience. I'd say lots of similarities to labor camps, actually, even though technically this was more of a labor camp without a roof, basically. So they still had to do back-breaking work. They still Or in Uzbekistan, it would be cotton fields, So just slave conditions. Experts just usually characterize this entire period. The resistance was in surviving, basically. Just by surviving, you rebelled against what was done to you. Then we have the usual political repressions. In this case, I would say they're not, like the absurdity of them, the scale of them was very typical, not just to the treatment of Crimean Tatars. Most national activists, dissidents, just people speaking their minds easily would get years of labor camps. And of course, this has also been done to Crimean Tatar activists. So scam trials, years of labor camps, the brutality of people running those camps, arrests, raids, searches. For example, one of the earliest memories of my father was hiding on the balcony together with his younger brother while the KGB raided the apartment in the middle of the night. And as he tells me, when in the morning he went outside and realized that the entire Crimean Tatar neighborhood has been raided, this was the moment when he realized that he had a nationality. That his nationality was distinctly different from everybody else's and that he will be punished for this. So yes, oversight and surveillance is very closely tied to the political repressions aspect. Surveillance, raids, you were in the books. Then another one is attempts to prevent mass gatherings. So not just dispersing the gatherings that are already there with batons and the usual brutality, but just blocking the roads. Or, for example, forbidding the vehicles to stop at a certain village. For example, if there was a funeral at the village, you would not be allowed to stop there. Or if you did stop, and somehow you got to the funeral, the agents would take note of every single car. They would write down who they have seen at the funeral, and you get into their book. Another one, which very indicative of some settler colonial regimes, is those social manipulations. So as I said, attempts to induce those anxieties of settlers in Crimea, but also, interestingly, right after the deportation, and before the deported before they arrived to the new places where they lived, the locals would be told by government agents that the traitors are coming. Or that not just the traitors, not just the enemies, but who's coming, they're devils. They have horns on their head. They're fueling all of those anxieties, all of those negativity against the newcomers so that the locals can't help them.
Or they were saying that they are very aggressive, they're murderers, they're going to kill you, they're going to rob you, they're going to rape you or anything, as there are some barbarians, they are not civilized people.
I've seen reports of people from Uzbekistan that they genuinely believe that they would be scared, and they would be gathering at the train station in groups, ready to fight if need to. And then the door would open, and there would be just emaciated old people, dead kids, crying women, people who haven't eaten anything for several days in stifling train carts. Yeah, at some point, of course, the locals realized that they've been lied to, but still it had some effect. And I'd say another social manipulation is that even after the decree that admitted that Crimean Tatars were not traitors, this news did not get to the mass media. The Soviet Union was still told that they're traitors, and nobody knew about the update.
Even if they did, they would still prefer to believe the old narrative that they were traitors and that is it.
And the final mechanism, I'd say, is the policy system, Crimea without Crimean Tatars, which we talked about. So all the laws and prohibitions designed to remove Crimean Tatars from Crimea and prevent new attempts to move.
What is known is that Crimean Tatar national movement was never violent. It is known to be non-violent. Yeah, there are cases when people fought, but general, the protests were peaceful and they included some banners, whatever, but it was never a raid or something like that. So you're great at classifying things. So could you please classify the methods that Crimean Tatar national movement used that made it so unique in the human rights activism history?
So unique. Well, I'd say that the methods themselves weren't exactly unique. What made them unique is the scale of people participating and just how long that continued despite all of the pressure to stop that. The methods, I personally classified them into three groups. The first one would be the methods meant for the fellow Crimean Tatars, which included community support. So, for example, gathering money for the delegation that would go to Moscow, gathering money for the family of an arrested person, which is also exactly what Crimean Solidarity does currently, building on exactly that tradition. Just like the police builds on the tradition of oppression that they've had in Crimea, Crimean Tatars in current occupied Crimea also build on their experience. There was also a lot of educational effort, people giving unofficial lectures about Crimean Tatar history. Mustafa Jamilov did that, actually. He was invited to tell students about Crimean Tatar history. Communities that focused on saving the language. So, for example, my grandma learned Crimean Tatar. I don't know the details, unfortunately. This is all she told me. But she learned it by gathering together with other Crimean Tatar youths and leaving the city to the places where usually those summer camps for pioneers were, like Artek and stuff like that. They arrived there off-season, where there weren't any pioneers there, and they gathered there and learned Crimean Tatar together. Or they would exchange letters in Crimean Tatar. They taught each other. And obviously they were trailed by cops all this time, so they had to, do some spy activity. Yeah. Yeah, sharing information, sharing knowledge about Crimea, all that. Also, lots of emphasis was put on just spreading the message, spreading the fire, basically spreading the spark. So in the early 1960s, this was exactly what those activists with the manifesto were doing. They were spreading those leaflets with the manifesto addressed to Crimean youth. So they specifically were looking at the Crimean youth, and they wanted to ignite the historical feeling, the passion for the patriotism, I'd say, in a way, but in a very distinctly different from what we call patriotism now, Data gathering and research. So the self-census that they organized, where they basically counted every single Crimean Tatar living right now, and also managed to learn where in Crimea people used to live, how they spread across Crimea before the deportation. And this also allowed them to learn, approximately, but still approximately learn how many people died in the deportation. And that had a really big effect. This is when the deportation began to be called genocide, and this was a very big point.
Could you please tell us the numbers of Crimean Tatars deported that were declared by Soviet authorities, and how those numbers changed during the research that was conducted by the members of Crimean Tatar National Movement?
You're asking about the number of people deported, and there's also the number of people who died, which are two different numbers. Well, by different estimations, from 230,000 to over 400,000 people were deported. Some of them died on the way there because the transportation itself was designed to kill people. So again, by various estimations, about 7,000 to 8,000 people died just during the deportation, at least 4% of the entire population. Again, there are different estimations of how many people died. One of the estimations is 110,000 people, which is about 46% of the entire nation. These numbers don't include the Crimean Tatars who were mobilized at the period, because we're talking who was deported. Deported were the people who stayed in Crimea, while most of the men, able-bodied men who were able to fight, were abroad.
They were recruited in the Red Army.
Yeah, they were fighting, or they were prisoners of war. And so when they returned from the war, hoping to see their families, they returned to an empty Crimea that they couldn't go to. And then they had to search for their families across Uzbekistan or Ural, and often they would find nothing. Thankfully, my great-grandpa found his family. 2 of the children have already died by that time. Some of them remained, among them my grandpa. And it was the army rations that saved them, actually, because he brought with him some of the army rations. And so they could eat. They had food.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. We're talking about just the systematic death of the most vulnerable parts of the population.
So there was a huge discrepancy between what Soviet authorities declared from what I've seen. It's 30,000 people or something like that. Yeah. And in fact, there was almost 200,000 people.
Yeah, by different estimations, but yes. The fact that we'll never know the exact number also is pretty haunting. And then some people died during the transportation, some died during the first years after the deportation because, starvation, obviously, dysentery, other waterborne illnesses. Because basically they were just dumped, often in an open field. They had nothing. They had to dig a hole and live in it, basically, and they had nothing to eat, nothing to drink. A lot of people died from infected water and dirty water. Also because Crimean Tatars were very used to a good quality of water because they were very, very talented at systems of melioration in Crimea. That was also one of the things they were known for. So yeah, the scale is unimaginable, I suppose. We're still talking about different methods of the movement, right? The first one I listed was actions aimed at fellow Crimean Tatars. The second is actions aimed at the Soviet government and Soviet officials, which is petitions, open letters, meetings with officials, requests for the mass media to publish their pleas, declarations, demonstrations, all of that. delegations to Moscow. And hunger strikes as well, what Mustafa Dzhemilev did. And I also added an important case of public self-immolation. What Musa Mahmud did, it was an act of despair, but it was also an action with a specific goal. Like, he didn't just do it because he wanted to end it all. He also hoped that this would be a message. The third type of actions is the actions aimed at fellow human rights defenders, foreign journalists, and the international public. So once again, open letters, informational bulletins that documented all of the human rights abuse, press conferences, unofficial ones, and also official ones, for example, the ones where Aisha Said Muratova would be speaking, communications with the press, meetings with officials, rulers of countries, artists, all of that. You made a really good point about the nonviolent stance of the movement, because Mustafa Dzhemilev himself, in his memoirs, he talks about how in that very first attempts at self-organizing that I talked about, when the students would gather and talk and decide what to do in the beginning of the 60s, they also discussed that they want their protest to be based on the Lenin principles, that it has to be lawful and it has to be non-violent. Perhaps it has also been influenced by the Soviet dissident manner of protesting. It also was very dedicated to non-violence. I would say that I'm qualified to debate if that was a successful decision, because you can hear a lot of Soviet dissidents who are still alive now talk about how, we were hoping that what we were doing would somehow put an end to this regime and give us a way to democracy. And evidently we have failed, because this is happening again. So, yeah, I don't know.
That is a topic for our next
that's a good topic.
I think it's worth mentioning who Mustafa Dzhemilev is and why he's so important. Because we know that, but for us it's obvious.
Well, to put it simply, he's kind of an icon, I'd say, because he's one of the most prominent, one of the most active, one of the most people with the most prison time, to be honest, as well, because how many years has he served? More than 20, I'd say. I actually don't have the exact data on this. About 6 or 7 terms, I think. So, and sometimes the terms were consecutive. So, for example, it was 1976, when he just had like 3 days until the end of his previous term, they gave him a new one. And he declared a hunger strike and held it for more than 9 months.
Which is the longest in the human rights activism history, I think.
Really? I didn't know that.
Yeah. Or one of the longest, at least.
Well, his friends were really worried that he's going to die like this. And actually, one of the allies of the movement, Andrei Sakharov, was, I think, more well-known for English-speaking audience. He actually asked him to stop. When they first met, it was at the trial of Mustafa in Omsk in 1976. Sakharov wrote about Dzhemilev, addresses to nations and foreign journalists and so on. He mentioned him in Crimean Tatars in his Nobel Peace Prize speech. And as soon as he learned about this trial in Omsk, him, his wife, Elena Bonner, Alexandr Lavut, the one who compiled the archive, they all were able to get to Omsk on short notice to support Mustafa, and also to, Sakharov was aware of his public status, and so he knew that this would draw attention to this happening.
Because for us, for people who are involved in Crimean Tatar topic, Dzhemilev is like, okay, everyone knows Dzhemilev. Like, you don't even have to explain who is that. And he served so many terms, and he had such terrible life conditions. And he is alive and well today.
Yeah, he's alive and kicking.
80-something, and he's smoking cigarette one after another.
Maybe that's why.
Seriously, we had an interview, and he was like, no, I'm not going to sit in the lobby. We need to go outside. And it was winter. Like, yeah, let's go outside and we will talk there. We were freezing, and he kept smoking one after another. And, yeah.
I feel like lots of older Crimean Tatar people are physically sturdier and more active than we are. Like I told you about my grandpa, who's going on walks every single day, and he's in his late 80s.
Yeah, my granny was cutting the woods when she was 75 still.
Wow.
So, yeah. She
yeah.
was able to do that. I mean, that's what they forced to do when they were deported to Ural. But still, they were physically so strong. My mom, who was a teacher, she, okay, this is totally a different story, but I want to put this in here. So when we moved to Crimea, we moved to bare land, basically, and we had little burzhuika, little fireplace to heat up whatever we had. And it was my granny who was cutting the wood. And my mom, she was trying to do so, but she was flying back with with an axe because she was a teacher.
Yeah. And your granny was like, move, I'll do it. Yeah?
Yep, exactly.
Wow.
Yeah.
My favorite little story about Sakharov's presence there is that him and the other supporters, they were not allowed inside the trial room, so they could only wait and listen in the hallway. But since they were arguing with the officials and they were pretty loud, at some point, Dzhemilev asked his sister what's going on, what's all the ruckus, and she replied in Crimean Tatar that those are our friends, and the loudest voice there is sheker. Sugar. It's sugar because Sakharov is literally like sugar. Sakhar means sugar, so that was a clever way to let him know that Sakharov was there.
Wow.
Yeah. And then
Crimean Tatar is a code language. Right? I loved it.
Yeah. And then his sister Vasviya was immediately asked to leave the courtroom because you can't use non-Russian languages. And then Sakharov and his wife got into a fight with some of the officials in the hallway, but that's a completely different story. I just really like it.
Thanks for sharing all that. It's so interesting.
Also an interesting thing that there was also a large diaspora abroad, Crimean Tatar diaspora, for example, in the United States. So just another example, 1973, in April, there were rallies and demonstrations of Crimean Tatars and Soviet immigrants of other nationalities in New York, in front of the United Nations building. And a lot of it was done by Aisha Muratova. She left for the US in 1978. Yes, she leaves for USA. She is a historian. She was also persecuted and had some prison time because of her activity. And again, you can see how the importance of history and its knowledge, how it pushes people to become activists. And after leaving for the USA, she hosted numerous radio broadcasts on Deutsche Welle, BBC, Voice of America, Radio Freedom, participated in international human rights conferences, including 3 Muslim international conferences, organized by the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. And another fun fact, at the conference held in Kuala Lumpur, she spoke in national Crimean Tatar dress and was the only woman among the participants.
Wow. And she is still alive, by the way.
Yeah,
I just
right?
checked.
Like, they're so much cooler than us. Like, they're not going anywhere, hopefully. She was also the first Muslim woman to meet with President Reagan. She met with him twice in the White House. She also met with presidents of Turkey and Czechoslovakia. She was, like, involved with Amnesty International. She did so much.
As we see, solidarity and strong connections with the wider human rights movement are crucial for the Crimean Tatar resistance. So I would like to close this episode with a story of a lifelong friendship between Crimean Tatar activists such as Mustafa Dzhemilev and Aisha Muratova, and Petro Grigorenko, a Ukrainian dissident, founding member of the Moscow Helsinki Group and the Ukrainian Helsinki Union.
Grigorenko's apartment was like a hub for...
headquarters.
Basically, yes, because he hosted a lot of Crimean Tatars who would, for example, come to Moscow and they didn't have a place to stay and they would go to Grigorenko. Aisha Muratova, for example, this is exactly how they met. Dzhemilev also was living at his apartment for a while until he was arrested. So yeah, it was a large hub, and Grigorenko also says that at some point he was trailed somehow, sometimes by the authorities, obviously, so they were keeping surveillance on him. And at some point he noticed that he's being trailed by, Crimean Tatar-looking guys, and he was kind of confused about this, and he talked to, I think, Dzhemilev, and Dzhemilev was like, don't worry about it. Like, those are our guys. They're good. Just don't worry about it. So they were also kind of keeping an eye on him. So it was a mutual symbiosis of powerful friendship. A good illustration of the power of this friendship was that in middle of 90s, Crimean Tatars decided to erect a monument to Grigorenko in Crimea, which the Crimean authorities didn't like. And then Crimean Tatars threatened to bulldoze every single Lenin statue in Crimea if the Grigorenko statue doesn't stay. And the statue stayed.
Oh.
Yeah. So they erected it like on their own accord. They didn't ask for permission from the Crimean authorities.
I'm from Crimea, and I do not know these details. I don't even know where the statue of Grigorenko stays, like in Simferopol, I assume?
I think in Simferopol, actually. But it's no longer there, because guess what? The occupants got rid of it.
And especially Grigorenko is a Ukrainian,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
it's like another reason to
course,
get rid of it.
Of course.
Could you tell us who General Grigorenko was?
Grigorenko was not just a venerated war-tested general, he was also a professor at the Frunze Military Academy and a candidate of military sciences. So he taught military history, theory, and cybernetics, actually, which was more of an experimental science back then, and he was very excited by it, actually. He was genuinely very invested. He was a Ukrainian patriot who cared deeply about the independence of Ukraine and its identity and his own Ukrainian identity. He was a general, a very successful one, and very venerated one, which makes it all the more important that at some point he no longer could, like his conscience couldn't see that what he believed in didn't match with reality. So after his public stance on the Soviet regime and its mistakes, he was dishonorably discharged, no longer allowed to be a professor, and robbed of all of his status, and no longer allowed to work in any respectable places. Basically, he was only given like menial, dirty jobs. And he was greatly supported by his incredible wife. He was a big wife guy, which I can relate to. And he was very active both as a Ukrainian dissident, and he was also active in Moscow because his apartment has become a hub for Crimean Tatar activists. He was later confined to a psychiatric hospital and had to endure several years there. Soviet psychiatrists insisted that he is insane, also a classic technique of pressure. And finally, he had to leave for the United States. He thought that would be temporary because he had to undergo treatment. And then as he was just ready to return, he was told that he's no longer allowed to return. He was banned from the Soviet Union, and he died in the United States, which also was a big tragedy for him. Dzhemilev remembers that that was the only time he heard Grigorenko cry. He was crying when they were talking on the phone because he loved Ukraine. He couldn't wait to return to Ukraine, which again, you can see the rhyme, you know. He also was not allowed to return. He died in the United States. He's buried there. And he still remains a very big figure in the Crimean Tatar national movement. And an interesting fact, before he died, when he was already doing quite badly, he could no longer speak Russian or English. He only spoke Ukrainian. That was his original language, and that was what remained with him until he died.
This is something that we actually discussed already, because my grandmother, who used Russian her whole life, like she grew up using Crimean Tatar, of course, but later she learned Russian and she was using it her whole life. But on the deathbed, when she was already feeling really bad, she started forgetting it and she was using only Crimean Tatar, the language that she learned first. And for me now, when I want to say like cute words or something, it's Crimean Tatar that jumps out. Because for me, up until 4, I couldn't speak Russian, just a couple of words. I grew up with my granny and I spoke only Crimean Tatar. But then my cousins came from Tajikistan and they were Russian speaking, and I of course I was more interested in talking to them rather than my granny.
Well, now you know what you will be talking on your deathbed.
For sure.
Guys, this conversation just got morbid.
Sorry, yeah, bit morbid,
I mean,
but
it will happen.
comes
It's
with
life.
the topic, yeah.
Yes.
You were listening to the Buryan podcast. Today with you were Alexandr Murtazayev, Elnara Nuriieva-Letova, and me, Eva Zbany. If you want to learn more about Crimean Tatar history, culture, and resistance, listen to the episodes 2 and 4 of this podcast. This episode was created in collaboration between Bida Media, Feminist Trans Localities, and Jemaat, a Crimean Tatar public independent media. Please subscribe to their social media pages. If you want to support Bida, please check our Patreon page. You can find all the links in the description down below. Thank you for listening.